Michael Bargo Jr. should be sentenced to death. Yes.
God! God! God!
I am sorry for taking me harsh mercy.
There are crimes some kids commit that are so bad, so vile, so sick that the court has no other option but to recommend death, like Dexter Johnson, who said actually assaulted his victim and then killed them. Or Michael Bargo, who killed a 15-year-old, burned his body, put his remains in paint buckets, and dumped them into a nearby quarry. What makes this worse is that sometimes these teenage criminals show absolutely no remorse, and in this video, we'll look at the most shocking reactions to sentences from kids you'll ever see. Dexter Johnson, let me tell you about this twisted case that unfolded back in 2006. It's about a guy named Dexter Johnson, who was just 19 at the time, and the brutal crime spree that landed him on death row. It all went down on the morning of June 18th, when Dexter and 4 of his friends decided to go out looking for someone to rob. They were just riding around armed with a shotgun and a pistol hunting for victims like it was nothing. That's when they came across Maria Apar and her boyfriend Hingo. Sitting in their car outside H's house, the group carjacked them at gunpoint, forcing them into Maria's car.
Ladies and gentlemen, the jury will feature your service. I'm going to meet you in the jury room.
All right.
But here's where it gets even more complicated. Dexter's legal team started arguing that he shouldn't be executed because he's intellectually disabled. They claimed his IQ was below the threshold and that he struggled with basic things like following directions or handling money. His attorneys brought up new evidence saying medical standards for determining intellectual disability had changed since his trial. This led to a federal court stepping in at the 11th hour, just a day before his scheduled execution, and halting it. The court sent the case back to the lower disability claim had changed their stance. The prosecution wasn't backing down. They argued that Dexter was fully aware of his actions and deserved the death penalty, so now the case is in limbo. The courts are taking another look, and the victims' families are left waiting for justice. But at least whatever the outcome, they can take solace in the fact that he'll be in prison for the rest of his life. However, unlike Dexter, the defendant in this next case was sentenced to death. Twix even after appealing. Michael Bargo, back in 2011 BGO, was just 18 when he became the ringleader in one of the most gruesome murders you'll ever hear about. It all started when he and a group of friends, Amber Wright, Kyle Hooper, Charlie Ellely, and Justin Stowe, lured 15-year-old S.E. Jackson to a home in Summerfield. Florida Sayeth probably thought he was just meeting up with people he knew, but what he walked into was pure horror. Once he arrived, the group attacked him, beating him mercilessly. Then in an act that's hard to even comprehend, Bargo shot him, but they didn't stop there. Prosecutors said they tortured Seth before eventually killing him. Afterward, they burned his body, put his remains in paint buckets, and dumped them into a nearby
Florida versus Michael Bargo Jr. Advisory sentence. A majority of the jury, by a vote of 10 to 2, advised and recommended to the court that it impose the death penalty upon Michael Bargo Jr.
It was Bargo's idea. The entire plan, the attack, the cover-up. He was the leader of it all, which is why prosecutors came down so hard on him in 2013. A jury convicted him of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to death.
The jury unanimously find that the defendant, Michael Bargo Jr., should be sentenced to death. Yes.
But here's where things get messy in Florida. At the time, a jury didn't need to be unanimous to recommend the death penalty. In Bargo's case, the vote was 10 to 2. And even though the majority wanted him executed, the lack of a unanimous decision led to years of appeals. In 2017, the Florida Supreme Court ruled that Bargo deserved a new sentencing hearing because of that non-unanimous jury. So fast forward to 2021, and Bargo finds himself back in court. This time, the jury didn't hold back. They
15-year-old child knew he was being dragged back into a house and was going to die.
And as the jury read the sentence, Bargo holds his. He heard, he'll be sentenced to death. It was like he was taking it all in, like he knew this was coming. But before his sentencing, Bargo made a last-ditch effort to argue his innocence. He told the court he had evidence that proved he wasn't guilty, but the court rejected it. He called the entire trial a circus, and even told the judge that if he was executed, his blood would be on her hands. Despite his claims, the judge didn't budge.
You told them where this rock quarry was. Yeah. Correct. Because nobody else knew where this was. This was your place. This was your idea.
The case also brought up a lot of questions about Florida's death penalty laws. Did you know Florida used to have the least strict requirements for sentencing someone to death? At one point, a simple majority vote of 7-5 could recommend execution, and judges could even override jury decisions to spare someone Bargo's case, along with others forced lawmakers to re-examine these rules.
There's no indication that this type of violent behavior will stop.
No. Now at 29, Michael Bargo sits on death row. His father, who had been at almost every court appearance, refused to comment after the sentencing. And for C's family, the pain of losing their son in such a brutal way is something they'll carry forever. Next, a case with so many twists. A criminal who smiled as he received his verdict. 3 trials, multiple sentences. But all the same outcome, Nicholas. So back in 2011 in St. Petersburg, Florida, a police officer named David Crawford was murdered. And the guy responsible was Nicholas Lindsay, who was just 16 at the time. This case has been through so many twists and turns that it's hard to believe it all started on February 21st, 2011, when Officer Crawford, a veteran with 25 years on the force, responded to a call about a possible car break-in. Pretty routine, right? Well, as he approached Lindsay, who was just hanging around, looking suspicious, things took a deadly turn. Lindsay had a gun that he bought for $140. Can you believe that? And out of nowhere, he shot Crawford 5 times. Crawford didn't even have his weapon drawn. He was holding a notepad when it happened. He died right there. It was heartbreaking. Of course, the police were all over this. The community pitched in with tips, and it didn't take long before Lindsay was arrested. At first, he tried to come up with excuses, saying different things about what happened, but eventually he confessed. What's really shocking is that his mom, Denine Sweat, told him to go to the police. After hearing the description of the suspect, can you imagine how tough that must have been for her? Now, Lindsay was charged with first-degree murder, and at just 16, he was tried as an adult. In 2012, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, without parole. Back then, Florida didn't mess around with sentencing even for juveniles. But here's where it gets complicated. In 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that mandatory life sentences for juveniles were unconstitutional. That meant Lindsay's case had to be revisited. So in 2013, he was resentenced, and again, the judge gave him life in prison. At this point, he grinned as he was sentenced. But Florida passed a new law in 2014 requiring a minimum sentence of 40 years for juvenile first-degree murder cases. Lindsay's defense team pushed for this, arguing that he'd been trying to turn his life around. They brought up how he'd gotten his GED in prison and taken some classes, but the prosecution wasn't buying it. They pointed out that Lindsay...
I'm relieved that he got life for the 3rd time. He deserves it. I wish they would stop doing this.
The judge didn't see any signs that he was changing. So in 2016, Lindsay was sentenced to life again with a review of his case scheduled after 25 years. What really stood out during these hearings was Lindsay's attitude. He didn't seem to care much about what was happening. He even grinned in court while the judge read out his sentence. That grin didn't go unnoticed. Officer Crawford's daughter Amanda called him an animal for it and said his lack of remorse proved that justice was served.
It's been a long, deliberate process from December 11th, when Tessa Majors was murdered, until today, February 15th.
Now, Lindsay is serving life in prison. It's heartbreaking. But for the Crawford family, it all comes down to one thing: justice for the man they lost. That pursuit of justice runs like a thread through this entire video. It's the same with Tessa Majors' family, who after everything they endured, found some happiness in finally seeing justice served.
And what I want to say as the district attorney is that we will be very careful to safeguard all the rights that he has as we go forward with this case. We are committed, our office, as I know the NYPD is, in fairness in all our cases.
Luciano Lewis. Now let me tell you about this heartbreaking case. It was a cold evening on December 11th, 2019, when Tessa Majors, just 18 years old, was attacked and killed in Morningside Park, New York City. Tessa wasn't just any college freshman. She was studying at Barnard College, one of Manhattan's top all-women's schools. She had a passion for journalism, played bass in her band, and was full of energy. She had her whole life ahead of her that night. Tessa was in the park, probably just enjoying a moment to herself, when three teenagers approached her: 16-year-old Ron Weaver, 13-year-old Z Davis, and 14-year-old Luciano Lewis. These kids had no business being in the park at that hour, but they had one thing in mind. Robbery. Rashawn Weaver took the lead. He kicked Tessa in the back, knocking her off balance, and started shouting at her, demanding her money run your pockets. When she resisted, things turned ugly fast. Weaver pulled out a knife and stabbed her multiple times in the chest. She fought back as hard as she could, but it wasn't enough. Meanwhile, Lewis was holding her in a headlock, and Davis stood nearby watching it all unfold. What's even more chilling is how Weaver reportedly bragged about being bitten during the attack. They left her there, injured and alone. Security footage captured Tessa's final moments. She managed to stagger up a flight of stairs, bleeding and desperate for help, before collapsing near a guard station. She didn't make it. The